Hi, everyone. Welcome to 3GNY Stories Live WEDU Wednesday. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Gail Steinweiss-Peck, 3GNY board member, WEDU Wednesday director, and grandchild of 2 Holocaust survivors. I'm thrilled to be here for our 16th WEDU Wednesday. Tonight, we'll be featuring guest speaker Alyssa Greengrass, who has a fascinating story to share. We welcome all of you who are tuning in for the first time, as well as those of you who regularly participate in our programs. We are grateful for our community. 3GNY is an educational nonprofit for grandchildren of survivors and our supporters. As a living link, we preserve the legacies and lessons of the Holocaust. Our mission is to educate diverse communities about the perils of intolerance and to provide a supportive forum for the descendants of survivors. Founded in 2005 with a group of 6, 3GNY's membership is now at 4,500 and continues to grow. Over these past 15 years, we've held diverse programs of all sizes around the New York area. 3GNY has also played a leading role in launching other 3G groups, including 3GDC and 3GNJ, and we're in conversations with others around the country to expand our reach even more. Tonight's WEDU Wednesday program showcases 3GNY's flagship educational initiative, WEDU, which is short for We Educate. This 4-week training program empowers grandchildren of survivors to learn and compellingly share their family's Holocaust experiences in school classrooms and with community groups. We've all seen the heartbreaking studies stating the lack of Holocaust knowledge among recent high school and college graduates. The good news is that students who do receive Holocaust education are more tolerant and comfortable with people of different races and backgrounds. They are more willing to challenge incorrect or biased information and are more likely to be upstanders. Through our grandparents' testimony, we talk about the importance of stepping in early and often where small injustices are found, on the playground, in the classroom, and on the street, because it's the easiest and most efficient way to act. By the time Nazi tanks roll in, it's too late. 3GNY has trained over 300 speakers in New York, New Jersey, DC, and most recently around the country on Zoom since the pandemic hit. In 2020 alone, we trained 62 grandchildren, more speakers than any other year. Also in 2020, between speaking in schools, our live programming, and our YouTube channel, more than 10,000 people have heard our stories. And in total, throughout WEDU's existence, more than 30,000 students have been impacted. Hope is not lost, and we need to keep doing the work. You can help us accomplish this through a financial gift of any amount. This will go directly towards training more speakers, thus reaching even more students. We do not solicit donations from schools, teachers, or students. We provide our programming to schools completely free, and we aim to keep the cost of training to 3Gs as low as possible. There's a link with ways to donate in the chat, and we hope you'll consider making a gift. If you've already donated to us, thank you so much. And to everyone, just by being here tonight, you're helping us honor the memories of our grandparents and ensuring that never again is more than just an empty phrase. Before we continue, I want to personally thank Alyssa for participating in tonight's event. I've known Alyssa for about 15 years, and I know her sister Amy too. What a lovely family. Before COVID, Alyssa and I planned a 3GNY event together at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, where she's the chair of the Young Friends Board. That feels like it was just yesterday. I'd now like to introduce Avital Barnea, a 3GNY volunteer who has gone through our WEDU program. She'll share some remarks and then introduce Alyssa.
Thank you, Gail. As Gail said, my name is Avital Barnea, and I am the granddaughter of 2 Holocaust survivors from Germany. I live in Sacramento, California, and thanks to Zoom, I was able to participate in 3GNY's WEDU educational training last fall to learn how to most effectively tell my grandparents' Holocaust survival stories. It's so important to keep these stories alive since we are the last generation who will know someone who was directly impacted by the Holocaust. And so if we don't share our grandparents' stories, they will be lost to history. I had the honor of sharing my grandmother's story just last week over Zoom to students at Skyview High School in my hometown of Billings, Montana. I grew up in Billings, and while there aren't many Jews in Montana, it's just as important to share information about the Holocaust with those who may feel a connection to it through their religion or otherwise as with those who don't. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to tonight's speaker, Alyssa Greengrass. Alyssa is the grandchild of 2 Holocaust survivors, and she passionately dedicates her time volunteering for numerous nonprofit organizations to help educate about and combat anti-Semitism. Alyssa currently serves as the chair of the Young Friends at the Museum of Jewish Heritage and volunteers with 3GNY. She participated in 3GNY's WEDU training a few years ago, and since then has taught her grandparents' stories to students in numerous schools throughout New York City. Professionally, Alyssa works as a senior leadership giving officer at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, where she raises critical money for cancer research and patient care initiatives. She earned her undergraduate degree from Rutgers University and holds a master's degree from the Manhattan School of Music. Please welcome Alyssa Greengrass.
Thank you so much, Avital and Gail. And I also just want to thank David and the rest of the 3GNY board and community for giving me the tools and resources to share my story widely with you. Lastly, I just want to thank all of you for joining again to hear the story of my grandmother's survival. There is a lot to share, much more than I'm going to have time to tell you about tonight, but I hope that you're going to walk away with a picture of what Steffi endured and how she survived. From a young age, I always knew that my grandma Steffi was different. She had a thick accent, and her apartment was always filled with some strange decor, which my siblings and I joked about because it was extremely over the top. Now, I of course understand that it was very in line with a traditional Eastern European style from another time. I knew that Steffi was a Holocaust survivor, but I never got to speak to her directly about it. It's only over the last 10 years or so that my family would even share parts of her story with me. You see, as many of you may know, it's not that easy to be a 2G or a child of Holocaust survivors. It can be overwhelming to process the horrors of your parents' experiences, so there was certainly a choice that was made to shelter me from these stories for a while. I took it upon myself to ask questions, do more digging, and try to figure out exactly what happened to Steffi, some of which you will hear tonight. My grandma was born Stephanie Ferber on September 15th, 1918 in Transylvania. She was one of 7 children. There were 4 Ferber girls and 2 Ferber boys. She was the youngest of the daughters and the second youngest child. Growing up, she had a fairly normal and happy childhood. Her father, Jacob Ferber, was a school teacher, and her mother stayed at home. She was well educated. She went to public school during the day, on the weekend to Hebrew school, all until she was about 16 years old. She loved to sing and dance. She always participated in school plays and musicals. And all of the girls in her family got married very young and very fast, including my grandma Steffi. Steffi met Martin Schwartz in 1941, a wealthy car dealer from Munkac, which is a part of Czechoslovakia under Hungarian rule, and they met on the street. She says they only spoke a couple times, and the next thing she knew, he was asking her family for her hand, and they got married, which is quite different than the way it typically goes these days. And shortly after, they welcomed a child. At this point, World War II was raging all around them. Jews were faced with tremendous anti-Semitism, which included physical violence. Jewish stores and offices were marked and eventually confiscated. Jews needed special permits to use the phone, to receive mail, and in Munkac, there was a forced recruitment of young men to go to forced labor in the Hungarian army. In 1941, shortly after Steffi married, Martin was forced to go to one of these labor camps in Ukraine for several months. Everybody thought that this was just the price of war and still generally remained unshaken since the war hadn't touched their country yet. They were confident that this was a difficult time, but they would need to get through it and things just would not get worse. One day, while Martin was away for several months, he sent a note for Steffi and her family to meet him at a train station. Listen as Steffi shares a little bit of what Martin told her.
You see, they took him in Ukraine, and I never forget this. a couple months later, he gave a note that he gonna be by the station, by the train. We should come to see him because they deliver him in another place. And we went out, the whole family, to see my husband. And he was there, and we asked what he did and how his things, and he started to say that they throw in the he was the digger from the grave with others.
Mm-hmm.
And when they throw in live people, mostly live girls, because they bring from the small towns, they bring that time young girls from Munkács, from Czechoslovakia, from the borders, from the small towns. And, and he said that they throw in about 20 women and they shoot them to death. Matter of fact, one girl later who remained in life there in the grave somehow climbed out and came home to Munkács, and I met him there, met her there. But when my husband told this story, we thought that he must be not well, that something happened there. We couldn't believe this. And this was in 1941, not in here.
Mm-hmm.
And then later he came back and he went back, this went on and off, on and off.
I can't even imagine what must have been going through her head. Her husband, who she hadn't seen in months, was now telling her and her family that he was being forced to dig graves where people were being thrown into en masse. I wish I could have asked her about this time in her life, what it felt like to be so generally accustomed to anti-Semitism living around them that she still described her life up until around 1944 as generally good and happy. To feel so sure that the war that was raging around them wouldn't impact them more than it already had been. Steffi and her family were not alone in feeling this sense of security. Many Jews, especially Hungarian Jews, felt that the war had been raging for years and it still hadn't touched them enough and they would be protected. But when things started to change, they changed very quickly. Hungary was invaded in March of 1944. Steffi learned about the invasion on the radio on a Sunday evening, and by Monday morning, Jews were being forced to wear stars on their clothing and her life would be forever changed. In a matter of days, all Jews from Munkács were forced into a ghetto. People were told they could only take a few personal belongings and were marched in the streets towards the ghetto. Steffi was walking with her family towards this brick factory where they were all moved to when she all of a sudden realized that her stove was dirty. She actually left the line of people, ran back to her home, cleaned up her stove, cleaned her apartment, rejoined her family, walking towards the brick factory. In her recorded testimony, when she tells this story, she actually audibly laughs to herself, saying she can't believe how stupid and naive she was. But again, this just tells you about her frame of mind and what everybody was thinking. Steffi arrived at the ghetto and she was forced to undress and was robbed of all of her personal belongings. It was atrocious. It was dirty. There was almost no food. There were no beds, and the horrible conditions left many for dead. People immediately grew fearful and unsure of what was to come next. Steffi tells a story of meeting a young American man who got wrapped up in these deportations. He showed his passport and identification papers to the soldiers and begged for his release. He was immediately shot. Nobody cared that he wasn't from Munkács or Czechoslovakia or Hungary or anywhere in Eastern Europe. He was a Jew. Within a matter of weeks, the Munkács brick factory, where my grandmother, her husband, and now 6-month-old baby Susie, the rest of her family, was emptied and sent to Auschwitz. People were physically forced and jammed into cattle cars. There were around 100 people in each car, with no room to even move an inch, no fresh air, and 2 buckets in each car, one for water and one for the toilet. The car only moved in the night, and it took about 3 days to get to Auschwitz. Many people did not survive the journey. from these conditions. I just quickly want to show you these two photos of Martin's family. On the left, you'll see Martin in the back in the middle with his two brothers, two sisters, and parents. And on the right, you will see one of Martin's sisters on her wedding day with his family. The only person from these photos to survive was one of Martin's sisters, Lily, who actually survives with Steffi and is with her the entire time, more of whom you will hear about soon. So when they arrived in Auschwitz, the doors of her car opened and there was chaos. People were screaming, there was thick smoke from a crematorium, and before she knew it, somebody had snatched her 6-month-old Susie from her arms and said, "You will thank me later," before she even had a moment to say she, of course, wouldn't want to be separated from her child. So men and women were also separated, and this was the last time she saw all of her family except for Lily. She was lined up in front of SS officers who pointed to one side, which meant she was fit for work. People who were pointed to the other side were immediately sent to gas chambers. The elderly and the children were killed right away. After she was stripped and her head was shaved, she was ushered into a barrack, Barrack 10. Here is Steffi shares a little bit about what she saw.
And they said that now they're bringing us to the shower. So some of them, we marched again, we went, we don't know where I went, but when I passed by somewhere, I heard screaming, Shema Yisrael. Such a screaming in my life, I never gonna forget that voice, what I heard that evening. And finally, we arrived to a barrack. They took us in the barrack. Not many of us. I would say not even 100. They put people in different places. So I say to the women, girls, young girls was there from Czechoslovakia, and I asked them, where's in the family and everything. So she explained that till they cut our hair, they are in the Komen. And the Komen is the gas chamber. Yes. And then she explained to us that I said that I heard something that they're going to bed, to make a bed for them. So she explained to us that when they opened there, and I said that I heard such a screaming and everything to the girl there, she said that when they opened up the shower, gas came, and then they fell in through the Boden, they fell in the fire there.
Most people who were killed in Auschwitz were murdered in the gas chambers, many of whom were promised a warm shower. The SS, as Steffi explained, even made Jews burn thousands of their own people who were gassed. Here you can see a map of Auschwitz and the rows of barracks filled with people, one of which would be the barrack where Steffi stayed. Each day, a doctor would come by and physically examine everyone. They would ask 50 volunteers to go and work. Steffi decided very early on that neither she nor Lily would ever volunteer to do anything. They would never go anywhere unless they were physically forced to. And this instinct definitely helped save her life. Like clockwork, every single day, 50 people would leave and they would never come back. One day, a female officer forced a group of 50 women, including Steffi and Lily, to leave their barrack and to go to the showers. The officer told them, "This is truly the first group that is going to leave this place." And Steffi had a slight feeling of hope. She didn't know what else was to come, but she told Lily that if they really did leave this place, that she thought they might survive. Out of 1.3 million people who were sent to Auschwitz, 1.1 million were murdered, and Steffi and Lily were two of the lucky ones who left. Steffi and Lily were then transported to numerous camps in a short amount of time. She was first transferred to Breslau, where she worked in an ammunition factory, but only remained there a few weeks because the camp was bombed, so they were forced to leave quickly. At this point, it was winter and there was snow on the ground, and she and the others with her were forced to walk. She had just a thin cloth covering her and no shoes. People who were too weak to walk were immediately shot and left on the ground. There was no food, and she managed to scoop up a little bit of snow just to get some hydration. After 3 days of nonstop walking, she arrived at Rosen, a few days later to Mauthausen, and then finally to Bergen-Belsen. The horrors of Bergen-Belsen were overwhelming. She saw bodies piled high as 2 stories because there wasn't enough firewood to burn them. She slept on the cement floor next to rats and mice, cramped up on top of other people every single night. She was assigned a job, and her job was to collect the clothing and possessions off of people who were killed and to sort them. Even though she had a job, the camp was significantly less organized than Auschwitz. People were not counted daily, and so she was able to hide and escape work, and she was able to sneak some food by running away. She was constantly beaten, and officers released a pack of angry dogs on her and others constantly for amusement. She developed terrible infections from some of these wounds that took years to heal, in addition to a stomach infection. But one day, the British came to liberate the camp on April 15th of 1945 when the Germans surrendered the camp. It should be noted that the British soldiers who came to liberate Bergen-Belsen were completely unprepared for the scale and degree of horrors that awaited them. Thousands of extremely ill and emaciated people in desperate need of medical attention. Over 13,000 corpses were scattered and piled all over the camp. Steffi was immediately taken to a hospital for 3 months to treat her various infections. She was hopeful that Martin and others of her family had survived, but she later learned that everybody was gassed in Auschwitz. She was then brought to a displaced person camp in Germany, where she had to stay for several years, and she hated it there. It was dirty, and she felt like she was in this place of being half free. But while she was in the camp, she met another Holocaust survivor, Charlie Greengrass. Charlie was working as a messenger, delivering mail and packages in the camp. Charlie, whose story I don't have the time to share fully with you tonight, was an auto mechanic who was married with a 13-year-old son. Charlie and his brother actually managed to escape from Auschwitz, but his son was tragically murdered in front of his eyes, and his wife was killed when taken to Treblinka. But Steffi and Charlie soon married and got papers to come to America. They moved to the Bronx and started a new life together. Steffi became a seamstress and started her own business through her home, altering custom clothing. Charlie learned to butcher and opened up a kosher butcher shop in the Bronx. Shortly after, they welcomed one child, my dad. Steffi's youngest brother actually also lived, but did not go through the Holocaust. He actually left Europe well before the war and moved to Israel to start a family. After the war, Steffi tried for years to try and locate her younger brother. And in 1959, my dad was able to help reconnect them. And in 1960, my grandma, my grandpa, and my dad all went to Israel to meet the rest of their family, those cousins of whom I am still very close with to this day. I feel a deep sense of responsibility to share the stories of Steffi's experiences. My involvement with 3GNY and other organizations such as the Museum of Jewish Heritage allow me to honor her resilience and strength through testimony. It frightens me to say we live in a world where anti-Semitism is not just a problem that our grandparents experienced. It's spreading throughout Europe, throughout our country, in our own New York backyard. We have to always remain vigilant and continue to educate and share the truth about the atrocities of the Holocaust and teach its many lessons of hate, prejudice, racism, anti-Semitism, and complicity. So if you can, I hope you will consider supporting this incredible organization. Thank you.
Alyssa, thank you so much for gifting us with your family's story. We're now going to open it up for questions. If you have a question for Alyssa, please type it in the Q&A. Due to the high volume of questions we typically receive, we may not be able to answer every single one, but if your question is not addressed tonight, please email info@3gnewyork.org and we will relay it to Alyssa. Thank you for understanding. My first question is, having to do with your grandfather. You mentioned that he escaped from Auschwitz, right? Can you just, that sounds really interesting. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Sure. So, the one thing I'll quickly say before I jump into it is that my grandmother talked about her story constantly. She told everybody about her experiences. And I saw somebody asked about this. Yes, that my grandma participated in the Shoah Foundation tapes, which is where some of those clips came from. My grandfather, on the other hand, never spoke of his experiences. So there are still a lot of gaps that I have in terms of understanding everything that happened to him. And it is a goal of mine to figure out his whole journey and then actually do WEDU again with his story. But what I do know is that with his brother, Mike, the two of them were in Auschwitz and they were being transported somewhere within the camp on an open truck, and they made the decision to jump, and they were able to actually jump and make their way out of the camp and eventually survive in the forest. They dug a hole and lived in the woods, and a family had found them and would bring them food once a week. And they stayed there for several months until they were notified that the war was over. It's extremely unusual, I understand, that somebody was able to escape from Auschwitz that way. So I really look forward to trying to learn more about his story and figure out what happened there.
We have a question in the chat. Someone is wondering what happened to Steffi's 6-month-old child that was taken away from her at Auschwitz?
So no children, especially young children, especially babies, really survived Auschwitz. So what happened was somebody took her child from her, and presumably her child was immediately killed. When somebody said to her, you will thank me later, as horrific and horrible as that is, people who stayed with their young children were more likely to die because the children, there was no use for them in Auschwitz. I mean, it was a place for people to be killed and for some people to work. And so there was, honestly, as awful as it sounds, there was no use for a small child there. And so presumably she was immediately killed.
This next question is about Lily. Did Lily survive and make it out?
Yeah, so Lily survived and actually was with Steffi as she went to all of the different camps. And I know I expedited a bit through that just for the sake of time, but she did survive. And when she came over to New York as well. Lily moved to Queens, I'm pretty sure Flushing, and when my grandmother and Charlie settled in the Bronx.
There's a question about your grandfather's story. What country was he in when he hid in the woods?
I am pretty sure it's Poland, but don't quote me on it. I still have a lot more to learn there.
How do students react to your grandmother's story when you share it in the classroom?
That is such a good question. I have had such a wide range of reactions from students when I've shared this story. Doesn't matter how old they were, if it was public school, Hebrew school, Christian school, whatever it is. I think the first thing that is a common thread amongst almost all the students I've presented this to is just the feeling of shock. I think, we're lucky in New York and in some school districts, at least I was growing up, that Holocaust education was a core part of our curriculum and that I knew a lot about the Holocaust. But when you're going into these schools where a lot of students, Holocaust curriculum and lesson plans are condensed to maybe 2 paragraphs where they read that, 6 million Jews were killed. When you break it down into just looking at a photo of someone's grandma or someone's grandpa, it has a really different impact on people. Even for adults, we talk about the atrocities of the Holocaust in such broad strokes. Even I said 1.3 million to Auschwitz went and 1.1 were killed. Those are unbelievably difficult numbers to have to process and internalize. And when you're staring at a person and you're looking at them with their grandma and you're just explaining what happened to someone's family, it just really affects people. And I'll never forget, actually, one of the first classrooms I went into from WEDU, I had a little boy, I'm pretty sure it was middle school, come up to me and say, my parents told me that they don't like Jews. We've talked about this, it's come up, and you seem really nice. I'm going to remember. And I sobbed, just like immediately, like ugly cried, because I was so overwhelmed. And this is why we do this. It just is. So, yeah.
That's an amazing story. In your bio, Alyssa, you mentioned that you studied music. What did you learn about music and its connection to the Holocaust?
There's so much. I could give a dissertation on it, not actually, but so there are a couple different parts of music in the Holocaust. There are composers who lived and survived. There are composers who died and who were killed in the Holocaust. And then there are people who've written music about Holocaust experiences. Let alone then, of course, there were musicians actually who were performing in some of the camps. There was a band in Auschwitz that was used to entertain the SS. So there is a tremendous amount to learn about music and the connection to the Holocaust. Actually, the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York has, I'm pretty sure, some instruments and artifacts related to some of the musicians who were performing in Auschwitz in the Auschwitz exhibit that they currently have there right now. So there is a lot to learn there.
This next one is, was your grandmother tattooed?
So she was actually not tattooed. She was in Auschwitz Birkenau too. My grandfather was tattooed though. She was just immediately moved into a quarantine area.
Did your grandmother ever go back to Hungary, and have you ever visited her hometown?
So she didn't go back to Hungary after she left the DP camp before she went back to New York. She did go back to Czechoslovakia to try and gather some information to see if anybody of her family had survived, and through word of mouth, and she learned, of course, they perished in Auschwitz. I've not been yet. I do want to go. I would like to go see Auschwitz. I would like to try and retrace some of her steps. My parents have been to Hungary, not to retrace her steps, but they did go. And so hopefully at some point when we can all travel again safely, that is on my list of things I would like to do.
How many children did Steffi and Charlie have? And how did the murder of her first husband and infant baby affect Steffi mentally throughout her adult life?
So Steffi and Charlie had one baby, which was Susie. We're a little bit unclear of whether or not she may have gotten pregnant in the DP camp. Some of those stories that have been passed around have said she may have, others were not so sure. It certainly took a very serious toll on her. As I alluded to in the beginning, the way that she talked about her experiences, a lot of it was honestly too much for a young child who was my dad. It was quite a lot. And I think, there are a lot of, I don't think there's necessarily that much conversation around the challenges, at least within the 3G community, around the challenges that 2Gs have and the effect that it had on them. And sometimes even I've seen just in speaking to other 3Gs, that 3Gs take it upon themselves to share more about their family stories than the 2Gs do, because they were so deeply impacted and even closer to the experience of what happened to their parents. So unfortunately, she was haunted by her experiences her entire life in a way that deeply affected her husband and, of course, my dad, which I think, again, is where some of the initial sheltering came from.
Building off of that, what do you think accounts for your grandmother being able to survive all of the terrible things that happened to her?
It's a good question. She clearly had some really good instincts. I've sat and thought to myself, would I have had the same instinct to think, never volunteer, don't step up? Someone could have thought to themselves in that story I shared when she was in Auschwitz that, well, maybe if I volunteered, they would treat me nicer. There's all sorts of things. So she clearly had really good instincts. And she, of course, had a will to live. And that doesn't mean that people who didn't survive didn't, but I think that was a big part of it. And I also think a huge part of this that's not always talked about is luck. There is a tremendous amount of luck, too, that is involved with surviving.
How did she feel about Judaism after her experience?
She still was she felt very strongly about it. I know that a lot of Holocaust survivors typically tend to go one way or the other. They, really embrace their religion, or sometimes they reject it. But she continued to go to, she kept a kosher home. They belonged to an Orthodox synagogue in the Bronx. Nothing made her happier than being able to attend, first my brother's bar mitzvah, my sister's bat mitzvah, my bat mitzvah, to be able to see, what survival looked like and how her family was able to thrive. I mean, if she was alive today, she would be beyond delighted to see 5 grandchildren, great grandchildren for her. So she really embraced it.
There's a question about generational trauma. Do you think what your grandparents went through has affected your father, you, or your siblings?
I do. It's actually something I'm really interested in learning more about. I know I've done a smidge, like a fraction of research on it, and I've heard some lectures about the transfer of trauma, and how actually sometimes it can skip a generation, and how genetically there are a lot of things that can happen. Your genes could be altered from trauma. They've studied not only Holocaust survivors, but people who've survived the atrocities of Darfur and other atrocities. I certainly think that anxieties, have been passed down, and I do believe in the transfer of trauma there. I'll speak for myself, not to bring in my siblings in this. But I definitely think that there is something to there. And there's some really incredible research being done, especially at Mount Sinai. I don't know the full extent of other places, but I've looked into the research being done at Sinai of Holocaust survivors and their family members to look at their actual genetic makeup to see how things have changed through generations.
And speaking of generations, we have a question about your parents sharing your grandparents' story.
So, like I said, they really didn't talk about it for a long time, at least to me. I actually remember when I was really young, knowing that this tape existed, the Shoah Foundation tape, and that my mom didn't want me to watch it until I was about 15 or 16 years old. And I think we watched it together the first time. I don't even think that she let me watch the whole thing at once. For a really long time too, we just didn't even talk about the Holocaust in my home unless I asked the questions. But I am actually happy to say that, especially in the last number of years, as I've really taken it upon myself to get involved in 3GNY and the Museum of Jewish Heritage and a number of Holocaust volunteer initiatives, that we talk about it a lot more. And it's become a little bit more comfortable. And, my dad has attended some of these conversations or different places where I've been able to talk about the story, and he'll listen to it again. So a little bit, but it's okay. I'm okay to take on the sharing of stories for them, and I will continue asking questions as I want to learn more.
Can you tell us more about your role chairing the Young Friends Board of the Museum of Jewish Heritage?
With pleasure. So the Young Friends is a great young professional group at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, which is a living memorial to the Holocaust Museum in downtown Manhattan. And we do a number of events, social, educational, great blends of both. We've actually, as Gail mentioned, we've partnered with 3GNY on events in the past. We hope to do more so in the future. And it's a great community of people who, similar to 3GNY, want to be supporting the museum's mission of Holocaust education, teaching intolerance, and the lessons of the Holocaust. So in my role, I work with and recruit lots of young professionals to become members, attend our events, and learn more about the Holocaust. So if anybody's interested, happy to share more information. But like I said, it's another organization that really does great work. And again, really thrilled that organization partners with 3GNY, because 3GNY's educational training program is just beyond incredible.
Back to speaking in classrooms, can you share an example of a good or surprising question you received when you presented your grandma's story, and how did you answer it?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Now I'm thinking of like 3 of them.
You can say all of them.
No, I know. So something that actually surprised me, backtracking a second, when I first started volunteering, and even when I was in WEDU, I remember when I was putting together, my thoughts of which stories did I want to share, because, for example, from the Shoah Foundation tape that we have, it's like 2.5 hours, maybe a little bit longer. And there are so many stories about her experiences. And I remember as I was thinking and picking and choosing, it became really clear to me that there were so many things that I took for granted that I understood. I mean, even just saying, what a gas chamber was. I remember one of the first times I said that, and someone in my WEDU group said, there are going to be students who are going to have absolutely no idea what that is, or why you're talking about people going to a gas chamber. So I think in general, it was, I had to take a step back and really think to myself, okay, starting from complete basics. And I remember one student actually asking me, I'm slightly diverting a bit, but I remember one student asking me, how do you know that many people were actually killed? And I actually started thinking about this question again today, because it kind of comes back to this idea of what information are people getting? How can we trust? And what trustful resources are we getting our information from? And I remember explaining all about the evidence, and I actually talked a little bit about how the Nazis and Hitler had this whole plan to actually create a museum about what they did, and they were documenting purposefully everything, and they kept records because they were proud of what they were doing. But that was just another question that really took me back and made me think to myself that, there's a lot of educating we need to do.
After your grandmother was liberated, did she ever share any stories of altruism that people expressed when she was in captivity in the concentration camps?
She did. She certainly did. Yeah.
What's one thing you wish people would ask you about your history?
Good question. I think I wish, well, I guess I'll ask it to myself. I think I wish people asked me, what I wish I could have asked her, which I know I answered a little bit in my testimony, in my story of her testimony. But there's such a laundry list of things, especially now that I've, really dug into what's happened to her and still continue to research, because even with her story, there are certainly gaps. But because, you know, I really didn't get the opportunity to talk to her about the Holocaust, I would love for someone to ask me again what I wish I could have asked her.
There's a question kind of related to that. You know, given that your grandmother didn't share very much with you about her experience, do you feel like there was something unspoken in your family that was, this person says, hovering in a negative way that you could sort of feel that was unspoken?
I think so. You know, because of these experiences and the fact that, you know, she truly wasn't able to, in a lot of ways, get through without it haunting her constantly. She was difficult, just overall. And I think that certainly then played into family dynamics that I, as a young girl, was able to pick up on. Where exactly those were pinpointed back to is probably hard to speak to, but it's all related to the absolute horrific atrocities that she had to endure.
How do we react to Charlottesville and current anti-Semitism in view of Steffi's experience?
I'm not gonna lie, I certainly get triggered. I think, you know, I think comparisons in general are not appropriate. But what I will say, you know, in terms of specifics, in my opinion, but I will say that just the feelings that things like that evoke are very real. And I see it not just in me, but even in my father, who's a 2G. I mean, even, what was it, 2 months ago at the Capitol, there was somebody wearing a Camp Auschwitz t-shirt. And the fact that we're still having these conversations in America about people who are proud to be Nazis and people who are proud to support Hitler and everything he stood for is not only disgusting, but absolutely terrifying. Because at the end of the day, I don't want to be so doom and gloom, but, you know, everybody in their, you know, Steffi thought to herself that everything would be okay. And it can just honestly mess with you a little bit. So for me, honestly, things like that are quite triggering.
Given your grandparents' history, do you feel like you're more politically active or that their experience has defined you as a person?
I think they're related. I've always been a very politically active person, and an outspoken person, and somebody who has strong opinions and communicates them. I I do think that it is related, and especially in the last number of years, the more I've learned about her story, it's also broadened the issues that I've been passionate about. I mean, of course, I'm clearly passionate about Holocaust education and anti-Semitism, but I've also become really deeply passionate about immigration issues. I mean, my grandparents are here only because they were allowed to come here. But at the same time, as many of us will know, during World War II, there were tons of Jews who were turned away from this country who could have been saved. There was a ship full of people who were on their way to, you know, the US off the coast of Florida, I believe, and Cuba, and were turned away. And most of those people perished. And there are atrocities happening all over the world right now to many different people of many different backgrounds. And so for me, immigration is a huge issue that I've certainly become more charged about. And yeah, I do think it is related to my family's experiences.
Alyssa, thank you so much for speaking tonight and for sharing your grandmother's story. And Avital, thank you for being part of our program. Thanks again to all of you for joining us. We're glad you took the time to hear Alyssa speak words that must never be forgotten. If you haven't yet made a gift to support our educational programs, we hope you'll consider making one now. Please refer to the chat for ways you can donate. Thank you. Also, if you have connections with educators who may want our speakers like Alyssa to present in their classes, please let us know. We have a large speakers bureau of grandchildren prepared and ready to present, just like you saw tonight. We hope to see you again soon. We have some virtual events coming up, 3 more in March alone. Next Wednesday, March 10th, 3GNY will be featured on the Conversations with Alan series in the Locker Room on Wednesday, March 10th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. On Thursday, March 25th, we have an event with 3G Dr. Jack Fried, author of Heirs of Auschwitz, a true story of the Holocaust, transforming intergenerational trauma and the meaning of existence. And on Wednesday, March 31st, we have another WEDU Wednesday featuring Emmy-winning reporter Dana Arshin. We'll be sending an email tomorrow with details for these events and a recording of tonight's program. You can also check out our past WEDU Wednesday speakers and other events on 3GNY's YouTube channel. Thanks again for taking the time out of your evening to be with us. We are grateful as always for your presence and for your support.